to it, and she has the classic perfect response. She had terrible chest pain. The chest pain goes away. She gets a reperfusion tachycardia. Her ST segments come down. I mean, it's just a miracle, and I'm feeling so good. And then, you know, we rotate off at 7 in the morning, and I come back the next night, and I check on her. You know, I'm so proud. I obviously saved her life. And so I go to see her, and I'm looking through her chart, and they did an angiogram and an angioplasty scheduled for the next day. And I'm just beside myself. And I said, do you have any chest pain and no heart failure? No, I feel great, doctor. Thank you very much for taking care of me. And so the next day, you know, back then they didn't do ad hoc angioplasty. Do the angiogram one day, the angioplasty the next day. So the next day, I go back to, I see her, she's got an angioplasty scheduled, and I don't leave at 7 a.m. when I'm off. And I go to the library because, you know, there was no internet downloading a PDF. I mean, you went and found the journal, and I found the Timmy 2B article, and I circulated it to me. I copied, Xerox the Timmy 2B article, and I'm hanging out, you know, just you know, stalking in the ICU until the guy shows up and says, you know, Dr. Sitman. And I say, oh, Dr. Sitman, I see you're taking care of Mrs. Jones, and I'm John Spertus. I took care of her, and I see that you did an angiogram yesterday, and you're planning to do an angioplasty. And I just don't know, but did you see this Timmy 2B article? You know, it says there's no benefit. Why are you doing this procedure? At which point, you know, the guy basically picks up this guy, he says, so where did you go to medical school? And I said, I went to UCF. He goes, oh, figures, you know. And then he says, you know, look, I'm familiar with that article, but they looked at the wrong endpoint. You know, they looked at mortality, and they looked at heart attack, and they looked at, you know, exercise treadmill duration. But my patients feel better with an open artery, and that's why I'm doing the angioplasty. And I mean, it was one of these moments where I was like, that makes so much sense. Like, we just aren't even measuring if our treatments are making patients feel better. Like, it just really stuck with me that, you know, we aren't measuring something really, really important. And so it's an example of an idea coming out of clinical practice or coming from, you know, a talk you're hearing somebody give, where it just starts to gnaw on you. You get really interested in that idea. And you have to read up, like, are there ways of measuring symptoms and function? And are they good, or can they be improved? And, you know, in this thinking process, then you start working on, well, how would I take this idea into sort of something substantive? What would it take to develop a questionnaire? How would you prove that it worked? And, you know, through this iterative process of sort of thinking and working, and, you know, the Scholar Club is a tremendous example. We tend to focus more on grants than papers. In our Wednesday morning research conference, we often focus on topics and papers and all of that, but clarifying what's sort of the gap in knowledge, what am I trying to address, how am I addressing it, doesn't make sense, turns out to be an incredibly important sort of process of formulating a good research idea. And so these ideas, they tend to come from your clinical experience, from reading, whether it's guidelines. Editorials often sort of talk about the next big challenge. You know, talking with your colleagues, talking with your mentors. And to me, if the paper is worth writing, you really have to care a lot about it, you know. And, you know, there are people who are, you know, very methodical about laying out what they want. I've sort of always been a researcher of passion. Like, I really feel like this contribution is going to absolutely change the world. And, you know, that becomes very important because we'll get to it. But the biggest challenge is the serial rejections, people saying your ideas are stupid, you know, all of that kind of stuff. But if you really care about it, I mean, you'll take the insight, you'll take the input, but you'll continue to revise and improve what you're doing. But you also have to be practical. You know, I mean, I can't tell you how many residents came into me and said, you know, I really think we should, you know, do a good study and genotype a couple million patients and really figure out, you know, what genes are most important for prognosis and the benefit of angioplasty. I mean, there are practical things you've got to think about because it's very important, and your mentors are a great resource for that. because you often at different phases of your life have different resources available to you. You want to be sort of very sensitive to doing things that are can be done. The process of sort of writing a paper does sort of mandate thinking a lot about and understanding the extant literature. And, this guy, Brian Hayes, who's one of the founders of evidence-based medicine, said, to find new and useful answers to important problems that have not already been resolved, you need to know an awful lot about the problem and precisely where the boundary between current knowledge and ignorance lies. And it's that gap in knowledge. I mean, Yashu worked with me, for years, and every introduction ends up with, to address this critical gap in knowledge. You want to make sure that you have articulated for everybody this boundary so that you can address it and so they can perceive your work as important as you know it is. And there are many references about writing it, and I'm not going to replicate a lot of these, but these are all good ideas about trying to, let's see if I can get rid of this a little bit. Thanks. And so these are all sort of, ways of doing it. And, people like myself or other colleagues can be very, very helpful in thinking through it, how you formulate stuffs. And so when you try and refine your project, there are different established criteria. And to be honest, I don't use a lot of these, but for those who are just getting started, I think this is very, very, very helpful. And so the finer criteria asks sort of, is, the question worth answering? And when you try and figure out if it's worth answering, is it feasible? Do you have adequate power and expertise and resources to be able to ask this question that you want to ask? Is it interesting? I mean, will this knowledge have some impact on the way we practice medicine or the way the field progresses or evolves? Is it novel? I mean, are you confirming or refuting existing controversial areas, or are you going in an entirely new direction, like developing the Seattle Angiography Questionnaire for coronary disease? Is it ethical? Obviously, we don't do unethical things anymore. And is it really relevant? What's going to be the impact of addressing this gap in medical knowledge? And can you articulate what that is? Because that's very important. And, there are these PICO criteria, about formulating a question. What's the specific population you're interested in? What's the exposure or the intervention you're seeking to study? What is the comparison group? And is that an appropriate comparison group to compare with the intervention? It depends if this is a prospective randomized trial versus a retrospective or observational cohort study. Is the outcome important? And can you measure it accurately? And have you assessed? Do you have the proper time frame? If you're looking at the benefits of angioplasty, looking at in-hospital events may not be a relevant time frame, because you're really doing something now to prevent future things 1, 2, 3, 5 years down the road. And so there are many, and some of the references I gave, and I'm happy to share a copy of the PowerPoint with you, list the way of thinking about this. And, sometimes you're either asking a question or you're actually formulating a correct hypothesis. And, hypotheses are expressing relationships between variables. So I believe that, treatment with this approach will lead to these outcomes. And I'm testing those treated versus those not treated. In other areas, especially in the work that I do, that you do, we're doing more sort of trying to understand patient characteristics associated with outcomes or practice patterns. And so it's inherently more descriptive. It's not that it isn't unimportant. You can't make really important contrasts, and you can't really identify right now, for the last decade, our group's doing an awful lot of work on the variability of care, how much different patients are treated by one doctor versus another. And when you know the right way to treat it, it really highlights the key opportunities to improve the value of healthcare by addressing these variations of care. That's an example of more of a question than a hypothesis. And, to me, they're both equally important, the latter sometimes more than the former, but in the traditional academic model, it's considered not really science, it's descriptive research versus real hardcore science. But I'd love to go head to head with hardcore scientists about who's really generating the most important information to improve the world. So a good hypothesis should be very simple. And as we talk about writing your paper, this concept of creating a very clear gap in knowledge we're trying to address. And, there's lumpers and splitters, and we often, I really shifted. I used to be a lumper, meaning I would put as many concepts into one piece of paper so I could write one paper and generate as much knowledge as possible. And I've just learned over time that often people aren't tracking each individual component. It's hard to contextualize it. And so creating a more simple, straightforward hypothesis is very good. And if there are multiple outcome variables, to develop really a primary and several secondary ones. So for example, a really good example, next month, we're going to be presenting the ischemia trial. This is a large randomized controlled trial. It's taking patients who have stable coronary disease and have a lot of ischemia, meaning that when you do a stress test, 10% or more of the heart muscle is not getting enough blood flow. Today, 100% of those patients go to the cath lab and get angioplasty or bypass surgery. But do they really need it? Medical therapy is really good now. And so a very simple hypothesis, if you take patients with a lot of ischemia, are their outcomes better in treating them with an invasive approach, going to the cath lab and doing what you need, which is current practice, or can you just conservatively monitor that patient? The primary outcome is a clinical outcome of death and myocardial infarction. But as I learned when I was rotating at Providence Medical Center, how they're doing is critically important. So that becomes the key secondary outcome. And so we'll be presenting that next month. It's an example of a very simple hypothesis. I mean, it's a $120 million randomized controlled trial. It's a big study. It's a hard study. But you create one sort of main primary outcome and then several secondaries. And you have a clear operational definition of all your exposure variables. This becomes much more important when you're doing sort of observational or secondary data analysis. What's the relevant population? What's the exposure that you're focused on? And of course, you have to do all of this before you start digging into that data, because especially with the ease of doing statistical analysis now, you come up with all kinds of p-values that look really impressive, and that may be completely chance and random. And so we spend a lot of time sort of thinking about this. And, it's very, what I love about, a career in academia is that, it's not really the answer so much as the continued questions and challenges we do in our career to delve further and further and gain deeper and deeper understanding. And this is, again, getting to this idea of having a lot of passion for the topic and really devoting your sort of life to really making the world better by understanding something of substance. And so, if you've got a good question and you've got a good, study design structure and all of that, what are the barriers to publishing? Well, without...
Can we interrupt?
Sure.
So I actually was really impressed with what you actually said there about data set, because I think lots of us will get a large data set to analyze or something like that. And then that becomes the start of the quote unquote research question. But because we got the data and we weren't forced to actually create a priori research question, I think we lose some of what you're suggesting there. So I think this idea that if we have this large data set or something like that, still going through the discipline of putting some of these ideas down on paper may make some sense. But
I think it's incredibly important. In fact, it used to be the data was rare and very expensive and hard to acquire. Data is ubiquitous now, right? And so I think it's far better to have the research questions that you are passionate about, that you understand, that you define, and then secondarily figure out what data can best address that. And then there are challenges in that applying your hypothesis or your research question to different data sets you can tackle. But you definitely, it just kills me when people download the NIH data set and then just start running every cost tab under the world and then come to you and say, hey, I really want to study this, and it's very problematic. And that it ends up often leading to a lot of workflow productivity because and so you're absolutely right. Sitting and thinking through this before you start delving into the data, which is hard if the data is sitting on your hard drive, not to start digging into it. I get that. And I wish I could say I was as pure as I'm pretending to be, but the truth is that I'm so removed from doing my own data analysis now that they don't let me have any data. In fact, they keep all the data on a special secure S drive that I don't have access to. And so, no, but it's absolutely true that thinking through this beforehand is very important. And then, once you sort of get the data, you analyze the data, what are the challenges in publishing? And invariably, the number one thing is lack of time. You just don't have time to sit down in the rigor to get this done. In fact, the number two most common barrier is lack of time, as is the third. This is the bane of everybody's existing. And, my one of my early mentors, used to say that, medical writing is easy. It's the rewriting that's so difficult. And you have to rewrite over and over and over again. Now I'm so much faster than I used to be, but collaborate with me or be one of, talk to one of our fellows about what it's like to get, the edits on the first draft, the third draft, the seventh draft, because we're still constantly doing it. When I write a grant, we talked about this in writing specific games for a grant. I'll rewrite the specific games 24 times. Every time I sit down to write to approach to do the next section of the grant, I start specific games because you can keep making it clearer and clearer and clearer. And taking the time to do that is painful, and uninterrupted time is really hard to come by. Another barrier is that it needs to be perfect. You're never quite satisfied with the framing. You continually are keeping your new analyses. I will confess that I have a big problem with not being satisfied with framing. There's an art to this, and I'll share with you how I think about writing an intro, all that. But it is not uncommon, and I'll get to this later in the paper, where it's just not. The intro is not right. I'm not quite teeing up what the gap in knowledge is and why it's so important to address and what the implications are. And then I'll finish the paper. All the co-authors have approved it. I'm about to submit it. I'm writing a cover letter. And in writing that cover letter, I realized that I'm explaining the importance of this so much more clearly than I ever wrote in the paper that I go back and completely rewrite the introduction and discussion. And so this is a hard challenge. The other thing is, there are smart people. Go present your data to Paul Chan one day, and he'll just pick apart, well, what about this? What about this and this and this? And they raise all of these issues. And so there are people who just are never secure enough to throw it out there because maybe there's some confounding in this thing that I didn't think about, and so that's a real challenge. And if you haven't felt it yet, you'll feel it as you keep going. And the more you care about the subject, the harder it is. Some people just, who doesn't fear rejection? I certainly do. And so you just keep, holding on because you don't want to get out there and get it ripped apart, And then writing poorly is a real problem. The great writing cannot save a bad study, but bad writing can absolutely kill a great study. And, right now, we are when we evaluate candidates for our T32 program, I read that personal statement with incredible interest because if they can't write clearly on that, I'm absolutely not going to take them to the training program because it is so difficult. And so if you don't write well, take writing courses, learn how to do it. Martha Mantello gives those, other people give them, but it is a very important thing, and it's very difficult for people who have English as a second language. I really feel, I think it's a real disadvantage, and it's a challenge. And I've seen that many, many times before. Some of the key pitfalls in writing are being very clear about what you're trying to say. And you know, at your stage, you guys don't have this opportunity much, but at my stage, before I often write a paper, I presented it a dozen times in different public forums. And it is amazing how creating a PowerPoint presentation of your study forces you to think about how to convey this information in a very clear way to an audience that may not be familiar with it. So coming and presenting at our research group or presenting internally at the Clinical Scholars Club is very, very helpful, because what are you doing in a presentation? You're saying, what is the gap in knowledge? Why is it important to address? How does this project address that gap in knowledge, and what are the implications? I mean, that's the layout of a presentation. And, you know, doing that when you're in the formative stages of writing your manuscript is great. And it does really crystallize what you're trying to say. And then the example of writing the cover letter first. I mean, I've never done that, but I am amazed how many times in writing the cover letter, I've gone back and re-edited the paper because I had to do it. Or imagine, you know, as you're sitting to write, you're trying to pitch this on an elevator. You know, it's like Silicon Valley elevator speech for your startup company. What is so great about what you're discussing, and how do you convey that?
So, sorry, John, I'm trying to take lessons learned. This is so rich, even for people who have published a couple of things. But I think we've been doing an error when we've been actually having our group come together for specific games pages and reviewing them, because we've actually reviewed sort of the text. I think that we should use that as an opportunity to actually present. And so I presented my specific games page. It would have been better if I had actually said, okay, I've got the Morrisonized version of it. I can use that to organize myself, force it. And going through the rigor of putting it into that presentation would be a great iterative thing for me to do it. So I'm just reflecting on my lessons learned. So sorry.
Well, I'm glad it's helpful. I mean, you know, this is sort of what I've learned this by experience, but I'm amazed at how advantageous it has been to be able to present a more formal setting and to put yourself through the rigor of organizing it today in a short burst of time to an audience that's not completely up to speed with it. Using the passive voice. I mean, you know, if it's gonna, you know, passive means putting to sleep. You know, put your editors and your viewers to sleep. You know, that's not a good step to success. Being wordy. You know, if I hate when I say something utilize instead of use. You know, I mean, the idea that somehow if we make it more complicated and we're more wordy and we're more pedantic, that somehow therefore our work is more important is wrong. People don't get it, you know, and they're struggling to sort of put together all these prepositional phrases rather than being very clear and direct in the writing. And it's not that, you know, I don't have run-on sentences and all that. I do, and I keep trying to edit them down and make them crisper and cleaner and be more direct and more active. And, you know, it's a great exercise in writing abstracts or writing words. So, you know, we're going to write a paper for the New England Journal on this ischemia trial, 2,700 words. 2,700 words is really hard to do. But it makes the writing so much better because you're cutting away all the BS and you're getting, you know, I mean, I never use prepositional phrases if I can help it. Like it just, you don't need them. And so say things more clearly, more distinctly, more directly. And then getting feedback from your colleagues is very important. What you know, Ed and Amy and others have done to create this opportunity to present your specific aims, to go through them over again is invaluable, you know. And every time I've sat here, I thought that the input has been great and really elevates the work. Same thing with papers. And so we send a lot of our papers around. You know, track changes has made it so much easier than when I was doing this originally. And people were scribbling and handwriting and spend forever deciphering their words. And it can be very helpful. And you don't have to take everybody's suggestions, you know, when they give you things. And if you have a big enough authorship group, you get completely competing opinions. And that's good for you. You want to wrestle with that, but you have to ultimately settle on what you think makes the key point most clear. So this is, I think, the best part of this whole talk, which is just sort of thinking about how do you craft, you know, a paper. And, you know, to me, you're really trying to tell a story to the reviewer. You know, you've got to emphasize very clearly what is the import of this research? And you've got to know the literature well so that you really know the gap between, knowledge and ignorance, as alluded to earlier. And a lot of times you'll learn that from either reading, in your reading, they'll talk about what the next steps are, or editorials will clarify it. I mean, believe me, there are crappy editorials and there are crappy discussion sections, but as you read more and more of it, you'll really understand what the pressing gap is. And then you really want to frame the story, and we'll go through the construct of this, but that is very, very important. What is unique and important, and why is that so important? And how do you prepare your reader to appreciate this critical gap in knowledge and why it's so important to address that gap? You want to be relatively judicious. Now that we have so many online supplements, you can put more and more info in there, but really distilling it down to the key facts, the key graph, that's very, very, very helpful. You want to be a little even-handed. This is the hardest thing, because to get, through these first 5 steps, I now think this is the most important thing in the entire world, and the whole world is waiting for this great insight for me to give. And then you've got to be a little even-handed in talking about it. And then again, I think it's very valuable to get other input from colleagues or mentors. The title page is just very straightforward. It's very formulaic. There are instructions on exactly what they do. Just follow the title page. I'll get to what the reviewers and editors say. But if you can't follow these simple directions, how are they going to have any confidence in the validity of your work? Now, this is, I think, one of the most important things, the introduction. This is how you're starting to frame the context and import of your study. So it's usually 2 to 4 paragraphs. And, what paragraph 1 is what is currently known and what is the most important sort of gap in this area that you're studying. And, such and such has been shown and has had, but the results have, been mediocre, in part because we don't understand this, and something along those lines that will frame this. So for the ischemia paper, it'll be, it has been well demonstrated that in chronic stable angina, there's no survival advantage and transient improvement in quality of life associated with the angioplasty. But, prior studies have only enrolled patients after an angiogram has been done. And therefore, selection bias was always a risk to these studies, because those who the operator felt needed the procedure would never allow their patients to be randomized. What is not known is it's even necessary to go get an angiogram if medical therapy works as well, and importantly, to address this critical gap in knowledge and to better understand and apply the downstream implications of an invasive strategy in natural coronary disease, we conducted a randomized clinical trial of patients with very high risk ischemia to define whether or not interventional approaches were advantageous to the health and quality of life of our patients, something like that. And then, you want to say what is needed to advance the field. What is the critical gap in knowledge? How are you going to address this, and why is it so important to do this? If we understood whether or not any, visited catheter was important, this could markedly alter the current practice patterns of dilating all, narrow lesions, and ultimately save enormous amounts of money and avoid subjecting patients to unnecessary risks or something like that. And then you want to say in your last paragraph, what are the implications of this? If we understood that there was or was not a benefit, this would markedly alter the way we organize and reimburse care and blah, 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 blah. If you're successful in writing an introduction, by the time they finish reading the introduction, they're eager to go on to the next section, because you've created anxiety. They can't go to bed without knowing the answer if you framed it well enough. You guys have all read Harry Potter, right? I mean, the end of every chapter of Harry Potter, you want to go to the next chapter because they left you with like, oh my God, then what happens next? How does this resolve? That's what you want to do in your introduction, is you want to write it in a way that people need to know the answer. And this is what I'm talking about framing. If you haven't created that anxiety in the reader, then you haven't framed it well enough, or you picked a bad question, right? I mean, those are the two options. And you're not going to go to all this work and be ready to write if you picked a bad question. You've already gone through all your PICO and binder criteria and everything like that. So you feel it's important. This is why framing is so important. You know, there's a colleague that Ed and I know well named Harlan Krumholtz. You know, he's the master of the introduction. I mean, he will take the most boring crosstabs, you know, a secondary data analysis of the DIDGE trial, and you know, it's just a crosstab. He just took the DIDGE results and separated by men and women. And yet, the way he frames that introduction, you want to know, is the effective digitalis different in men and women? That's a master at framing. And that's what you want to do as you sort of think through how to create a really compelling and important paper. The methods are also a little bit more straightforward. You know, what are the patients or population enrolled? What baseline data did you collect? How did you characterize the exposure group? What was the follow-up data? And then, you know, your statistical methods. And it varies by, you know, discipline. For us, you know, we're doing a lot of work in observational data or clinical trials. Clinical trials are easy because there's no multivariable analysis and confounding, but it's sort of, what are the, you know, we're going to do unadjusted results and descriptives, then we're going to adjust for potential confounders. There's missing data, so we did these sensitivity analyses. We were worried about these selection biases, so we did that. And I like to, you know, different people try to do different things, but for some of these things like missing data, I put a lot of it into the methods and not into the results, because let's be honest, most people, except for scholars in the field, don't read the methods, and you don't want to bore them with, you know, you did 17 different, you know, imputation approaches for missing data, and there was no difference, so you're just presenting the primary results. Just get rid of it all in the methods, put it in online supplements so that your results are much clearer and easier to follow. Other people have different attitudes. You know, different journals will have different preferences, you know, but that's sort of my go-to approach.
I've had someone tell me put the sensitivity analysis in the methods if it didn't change what you ended up doing. But present some of the sensitivity analysis in the results if it had a surprise.
Yes. No, so if the sensitivity analysis influences your understanding and interpretation of the paper, you do have to present it. And we often do present, you know, a sentence saying, you know, I like to put it in the methods. If I can't, I put it in the results, and I say, you know, doing these 3 different sensitivity analyses had, you know, no clinically important effect in the results or in supplemental pages 2 through 6, or something like that. You know, there are other, you know, much more sort of methodological heavy journals that want all those sensitivity analyses in the results, and when you're thinking about the journal, you'll pay attention to what they want and go into that. The results, you know, again, is relatively formulaic. You know, what was the population? That's table 1. What were the unadjusted results? That's the second table of the first figure. What are the multivariable results, which is some additional tables or figures? Any additional analyses, if you need the sensitivity analysis, you put them in there. And you try not to interpret the results in the introduction as much, you know. I mean, that's what the discussion is for. And the discussion is very important, you know. The first paragraph of your discussion is summarizing what you found. And if it's the first time it's been described, say that, you know. The second paragraph tries to really put what you found in the context of the extant literature, you know. So-and-so looked at this and we confirmed or extended, you know, I mean, a common line will be our findings confirm and extend the prior work of so-and-so, or they refute, you know, the findings of so-and-so, or, you know, this has been a controversial topic and we confirm the findings of A and B, but not C and D, you know, something like that. And so I think it's really important because this is sort of, you know, in a sense, in the paragraph talking about how you're moving the field forward. And then you've got a couple paragraphs, they're really interesting findings you want to elaborate on. And, you know, in particular, we found that the quality of life benefits were, you know, much greater in the patients who had pre-existing angina than those without, which makes great clinical sense because the patients don't have any angina. How could you make them feel better? And only an improvement in survival or preventing an MI would be worthwhile, but we found no evidence of that, suggesting that there is no reason to move on to do revascularization in patients who are asymptomatic thyroid presentation or something like that. I mean, you're sort of this we found that digoxin worsened mortality in women. We don't know whether this is a reflection of altered, hormonal status or, different age of onset or a burden of certain comorbidities. And this will require further research to better elucidate the mechanism. But nevertheless, women should not, be presumptively given digitalis because it seems to be associated with excess mortality, whatever it is. Then your second to last paragraph is your limitations. Everything has limitations. I've written hundreds of papers that say our findings should be interpreted in the context of the following potential limitations. Now other people say our findings have these terrible limitations. I don't think that's right, because a lot of the times the limitations are just being raised as theoretical constructs. I mean, if you thought that your data was completely flawed and tremendously limited, you're just not gonna publish it, right? So I always talk about potential limitations. Other people have different styles. And, for our work, sometimes it's single center data. We had a certain amount of missing data. We had certain assessments. But when you raise a limitation, talk about why you don't think that's such a big deal. Or if you think it's a big deal, then either don't publish the paper because you think it's just faulty data, or say what the next steps are to really address it. This is a concern, and future studies should seek to not only replicate these findings, but specifically address this weakness by doing that. Something like that. And then you have a final summary of the project and its implication. That's the discussion. For references, every journal is different, right? So you have to use EndNote. I mean, this did not used to exist, be as good as it is now. I can't even imagine not doing it. All of our fellows are experts at EndNote. And when you get rejected, you get off and you have to reformat for another journal. How convenient to just tell EndNote to output in a different format, and there it is. But read your references carefully. You'd be amazed how, like EndNote, I don't know if it still does this, but the version I does still puts JAMA as capital J, lowercase AMA. That looks sloppy. So correct it, EndNote. Just fix that. Be thoughtful about, again, this just reflects the literature review. You don't want to sort of miss key references in the field, because Murphy's Law dictates that those are the people who are going to be reviewing your paper, and they're going to be bugged. So, and then, the text is first, then the references, then the tables, then the figures. We often see it in different order. Journals will explicitly say it, but don't, people, are want to see it in the way in which they expect it. The abstract I write after I read the paper, and realize that this is probably the only thing most people are ever going to read at their work. I mean, except, my work, they read everything, of course, but no, I mean, the truth is, this is all people are going to read. And when your paper's being discussed in an editorial meeting, what's happening is, okay, there's an associate editor who's handled the paper. Maybe the editor-in-chief has actually read the paper, but none of the other associate editors have. They all have the same vote. And so while the associate editor is describing the paper and addressing the reviews, they're all reading your abstract. So this abstract better be darn good. And, it has to conform to their requirements, and it should be a really discrete, distinct summary of what you did, what you found, and how you interpret that. And, this is something you really want to spend a lot of time doing. And then the cover letter, there are different theories about this. So, the current editor-in-chief at Circ Outcomes reads the cover letter first and pays a lot of attention to it. And when I was an associate editor at Circ Outcomes, deputy editor at Circ Outcomes, associate editor of Circ, I never read the cover letter. I just felt like if they could explain it in the paper, I didn't care what they said, So you have to pretend like they're going to pay a lot of attention to this letter, even though I never did. But, you know, it is very helpful when I write these in really clarifying why this is such an important study and why it's so relevant to this particular audience. And so I think that it is very important that you, do this cover letter and do it really well. And as I said, it may cause you to go back and redo your intro or your discussion, because when you're pitching to somebody else, all of a sudden, and maybe it's not that there's anything in sort of theory or substance different what you're saying, but the way you say it is clear, because you're really pitching it in a short and pithy sentence or two, and that can be very, very, very helpful. If you have any disclosures, I stated in the cover letter as well as in the instructions, and then you sort of have a standard thing. I hereby confirm that this paper has not been considered for any journal elsewhere. All the authors have reviewed the paper and agreed to its contents, et cetera, et cetera. And then submitting it. The best thing about being a senior as I am now is that I very rarely have to submit articles. And I hate when I have to submit them because it's a very painful process. Now it's gotten better. Now you can add authors by just putting in their email, and if they're already registered, they'll preload it. But follow the instruction of format and structure. Jack wants a page with all the abbreviations on it. Sir doesn't. Make sure you're very attentive to all those things. And this idea of making the article neat and professional looking. I can't stand when people just copy PowerPoints into their things rather than redesign the paper in a nice table. If the tables, the columns aren't all aligned, and they're all over the place, or they wrap across lines, and so you've got rows that are twice as high as other rows. It just looks crappy. And the gestalt, and we'll get to this to the review process, but the gestalt is that, well, they didn't take time to do a good job presenting their data. How good could the study be? Like it blinds people. And we realize this, you're asking editors and reviewers to look at your work, not like when they just been to the gym, had their cup of coffee, and sitting down with the whole day in front of them to do this, right? When are they doing this? They're doing it at 11:30 at night. They're exhausted. They've gotten 4 reminder emails that their review is overdue. That's when they're doing it. So don't make them work hard. Make it really neat, really clean. It should be a pleasure to read your article. And so that gets to maximizing the chance of success when you submit a manuscript to journal. So, first, you've got to select the journal. Who's going to read your paper? When you're doing all your review articles, where are those published? Has the journal already published 16 articles on this topic and they're just tired of it or not? This happens a lot. We had a couple of journals that we had to go to in my field, Circulation, JACS, or Outcomes, maybe JAMA, or New England Journal rarely. And, they published a bunch of articles on this topic. They just aren't going to allocate their scarce space to another one. Kim Smolder is running into a problem where she's written so many papers for the portrait study that some of the journals think, we've already published 8 papers for the portrait. And so, while this is excellent work, we feel like we've seen it on these papers. Think about some of that. And then how important are the results? Are very influential. What tier? Are you going to Lancet New Journal JAMA? Are you going to a subspecialty journal? Are you going second tier in that journal? I mean, you can certainly shoot for the moon, but it just delays a long time in the process. And your mentors can be very helpful in doing that. Understanding and following, all of the steps I talked about are very important. And really pushing yourself to get the work submitted by Thanksgiving. Really stick to your timeline, and if you work to just get your paper done when it's convenient to do so, you just will miss a lot of timelines. And so, getting up at 4 in the morning and just knocking the damn thing out before the kids wake up sometimes is a really smart strategy. And I encourage you to sort of try and stick to your timelines. I talked about making the document beautiful, getting feedback from others. The other thing is to develop a thick skin. I mean, rejection is so common. And I've been at this a long, long time. I've had thousands of rejections, and everyone hurts. To this day, it bothers the hell out of me. And when people said to me, "Oh, don't take it personally, just move on to the next journal," I was like, how could you say that? I mean, these guys, can't find their way out of paper bag. How could they possibly not realize the brilliance of this work? It's very hard. And so getting to the peer review process, realize that editors are overwhelmed, right? And so they just, I am so happy not to be an editor anymore. Every day there would be a handful of these things to do. Everyone, I used to read every paper from the beginning to the end. I never read the cover letters, but I read the papers thoroughly and did my own review of it. Like, it is such a burden. And so you're just looking and triage stuff out right away, right? So this is why everything I said about a compelling introduction, clean presentation, framing the importance of this, making it clear, creating anxiety in your editor or your reviewer to move on to the paper is very important, because they're just looking for ways to drop these things. And recognize the quality of the reviews can be very variable. And I was floored as I was an editor to see this, which is why I ended up doing all my own reviews on stuff. And so the paper comes in and the editor looks at it. If it's just junk, gone, Often they'll just say, "Oh, what topic area is it? What's my associate editor is best on that topic area?" It goes to them. And then the associate editor reviews it, and sometimes they triage out. I triaged over 50%, but I did a thorough review on all. Like I did the full review, and I was very inefficient. A lot of my colleagues would not do a review. They'd send it out if it looked interesting on the abstract without even reading the paper, and then base it on the reviews they got back. I valued my reviewers' time too much, and if I thought it was so lame that I would, regardless of what the reviewer said, I wasn't going to accept it. I got rid of it. Then it goes out to review, and you get these reviews back. They can often be discordant, and generally it's then the associate editor presents it to the whole editorial team, and they discuss it. It's a shame that more people couldn't be on the editorial board meetings of certain outcomes. The quality of the discussions, the way people talked about it, the biases that people had, and calling each other on their biases, it was really interesting. And I learned so much from that experience. Even though I would never want to replicate it again, it was fabulous. And I review much faster. I write better. I think about framing better, because when you handle 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 papers, you just get much better at it. And most of the editorial boards are not like the New England Journal. They're all paid full time just to be editors. They do a little critical work, but really they get up every morning, they go to the journal office and they read papers and they review them and they read reviews, and then they have hour-long discussions on every paper. It's extraordinary what they do there. Most journals are not that way. People are not paid, or they're paid a trivial amount of money for the time. They're doing it to help move the field forward. It's just they don't have the time and resources to really work through a thorough editorial process. And so they're going to make a lot of mistakes. But ultimately, they're either going to accept. I've almost never had this happen before. Revise and resubmit happens all the time, and it's great. And sometimes they just reject it outright. Believe it or not, the review process is supposed to be helpful. And I do pay a lot of attention to the reviewers. And, usually what I think, sometimes I've been struck that they raise something I never thought of. But by the time I've sent it out, I've had input from multiple authors. Very rarely do they identify some new critical flaw. What they identify is something that I did not explain clearly in my last edition. We always start at the highest tier journal, and when we get that rejection, then we learn what we didn't explain well, and we write it better the next time. By the time it gets into its third journal, it's so much better if I sent it that first version to the first journal. It would have gotten in, But in general, the reviewers are trying to be helpful. Sometimes they're trying to be punitive, but and you can sense that. There's a lot of variation in these reviews. You'll see a lot of difference across them. And, you should know that, there are it is not uncommon for us to get very favorable reviews and still get a rejection. And sometimes that's because it just wasn't a priority of the editors, in which case, why the hell did they send it out? But often, people write really nice things to you, but they write damning critiques to the editor. And, good editors don't, they will lose some of those critiques into the main body of the paper. Some don't. But sometimes, you'll see a real divergence. But those are these confidential comments that can influence it. And then, sometimes editors make mistakes. They missed, the reviewers clearly missed the boat. The editors didn't really dig into it. And sometimes that's our writing. But, you can also challenge a decision. We use this card very sparingly. Yeah.
That's a good question. So, how often does this happen? Like, you get, various reviews, and then eventually the prize is not met, and then you actually decline it.
So, it seems to be happening a little bit more than it used to. And I really can't. I would say that every year we have a paper or two that really seem to get very favorable reviews, all readily addressable, and it doesn't meet priority. And I think that the reason that happens is that they get onto the editorial meeting, and the associate editor is very passionate about it. They think this is really interesting. That's why they send out a review. The reviews are positive, and they lose the battle with the other editors. Say, oh no, this is known. This is that interesting, and then you can't imagine some of the picky points that some of the editors make on some of these discussions. In large part, because for one reason or another, they just didn't like the paper. They didn't like the methods. There's tremendous bias against these industry authors. So if you have somebody from Novartis in your paper, the critiques are 10 times more scathing than they are if it's not somebody from Novartis. And so I think what happens when you see this real divergence is that it's all in the editorial board. And your assistant editor was able to convince their colleagues this was worthy of publication, and they were favorable on it.
But could it be possible that some journals are more inclined to do this way than other journals?
I don't think so. It's a lot of work to edit. As a journal editor, you are so appreciative of your reviewers taking time to do these reviews that you really don't want to get them unless you think the paper's got a shot at it, And so I think that it is bad practice to set things out, get a lot of positive reviews, and still reject them by priority, because then you've wasted everybody's time. You've wasted the associate editor's time, you've wasted the reviewer's time, and you've wasted the editorial board's time. It does happen, and sometimes, there's a lot of flukes that can happen. A brilliant paper just came out that's on the same topic in the New England Journal, it's 10 times as big, and all of a sudden, the power of your presentation just fades away. I mean, I've seen that happen a half dozen times on the editorial boards.
And how often does you get not for good reviews, but actually the editors?
Well, usually it's a revised and resubmit. So they like the topic, they like what you've done. The authors of other reviewers have raised concerns. Those are great opportunities.
But still, let's say the reviewers aren't totally happy. But and how often does this happen that the editors do accept it?
That the reviewers are unhappy and then it's still accepted? Yeah. It happens. It definitely has happened.
You can get a biased reviewer.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of times, if you read through the editor's comments there, you can actually get a sense of who he's directing you to address. So you make it reviews, 3 different reviews, they're all over the board, and the editor is directing you to ones that you need to pay attention to. You need to address them all the time. You're going to show respect because it may go back after them.
No, I think what I'm really getting at is because, I think, so the reviewer, the expertise and the time is sort of perspective. When you invite them to, do the paper, and then at the end of the day, there's something, and if you don't actually go with the say, then how much do you
No, I'll get to responding to a reviewer's comment. It's the next slide. So give me just 1 second. Occasionally, I'll challenge a reviewer. I'll challenge an editorial decision. So for example, I talked about how I came up with the idea of developing the Seattle questionnaire. And where I really wanted to send it was the house of messenger. So I sent it to Gemma, they rejected it. I sent it to Jack, and they rejected it. And when it went to Jack, and first of all, I just couldn't believe the analyst paper. I was really pissed, And truth be told, it was a very important paper, right? I mean, it's been cited 1,000 times.
Every one of those journals would have been happy in retrospect.
Well, so this is what ended up happening was Jack rejected, because back then they thought that this belongs in a nursing journal. Like this isn't really important, And I basically appealed to the editor, Jack, who's very Bill Farley at the time, and I said, Dr. Farley, this has been rejected, these critiques, but let me make clear to you how important this is. And I talked about, how this is going to be the foundational endpoint for clinical trials. This is going to be very important ultimately in clinical care. And this article will be cited hundreds of times, and the journals care a lot about their science citation index, and they accepted it. And I feel the case is too. They accepted it. Same journal, same problem. Because Harmony was a basic scientist looking at myocardial contractions and stress curves and myocardial function. He had no idea what he was looking at. And so, occasionally you appeal this. Now, when you do this, it's a very delicate task. You can't pull this card very often. In my entire career, I think I've appealed 5 to 8 papers, and I think I've won on half of them, But you want to be very clear with the editor why you're rejecting it. These criticisms are easily addressed. And frankly, I often will send along the response to the review letter with it to address all these things, but then send another player, and why it's particularly important for them, not only the science fiction index, but their readership will use this for such and such reason. This is really the most important journal for it, et cetera. And often you can call them up and just have a conversation with them, and that's very valuable. But if they say no, you're done, right? So just be very graceful. Thank you very much for this consideration. I know it's a lot of work. I really appreciate the time. Now, when you get a revised and you submit, this is really important. I mean, this is your, you're the, you're Patrick Mahomes, and all of a sudden you need to get 8 yards down the line, and everybody's following your receivers, and there's a complete open pathway to get to the first down. You want to seize this moment well, and you want to make this very easy for them to review and do, right? So I really write for the editor as well as the reviewer. I have a cover letter, and I, say each, we've addressed each, now the journals are asking for this, but each reviewer comment we put in bold, so it's clear what is the reviewer's comments, our responses in plain text, and then I copy what I put in the journal, in the manuscript, right below on indented italics. And the reason I do that is that you're the associate editor, you're back, you're looking at it, and all of a sudden they made it so easy for you. You don't even have to go back to the paper and flip to another thing. You're just reading online everything that you've done. And if it's convincing and it's cogent, that makes it really easy for them. You don't have to agree with every reviewer comment. If you don't, they just say exactly why you don't agree with it. And you want to be very respectful, but don't be like, oh, thank you for this brilliant comment. Oh, bless you for this. Oh, it just gets slimy, say this was a very important point and we really appreciate being brought to our attention and we've addressed it this way. The next time, you don't have to say that. Say, we have addressed it this way. You don't have to keep saying how the great points are, et cetera, et cetera. And if you disagree, say, this is a very valid concern, but here's why we chose to do it this way. And then sometimes we'll put in additional analyses to justify that this concern they made has no bearing. And then we say, but because because of space, we chose not to do it. But we would be happy to add it to the paper at the editor's discretion. You're always willing to accommodate this, and I think that's important. When it's accepted, you just sort of, they give you a 2-day turnaround on the proofs. turn them around. I mean, it's and then now it's all about sort of working with your PR, getting the right Twitter handles, promoting your work. I mean, it's important. People pay a lot of attention to the ultimetric scores on papers. Yeah, I think it's I don't do that. I mean, I'm just of an older generation, but I would encourage you young kids to do that. So, I'm just going to end. I mean, I just think that this is so important to your academic success. And it actually is fun, and you get much better at it over time. I mean, it's a steep learning curve, and then it gets a lot easier. And yeah, I think that's the last slide. So I'd be happy to answer any other questions you have to address. I hope it was useful.
John, I just think it's frustrating that there just aren't that many places where somebody puts it together so nicely like we've done here. I think this presentation should be required for all the students in our honors curriculum. Class and scheduling.
And it's for me, I'm used to this, right? I mean, I was a cardiologist doing work on quality of life. Like I was always a poster session at the last day.
No, scheduling have to, they would have loved this because frankly, they're in the grant writing class and half of what you've just said is
would apply to the grants
completely germane to that. But this is awesome. And so, and particularly, it's he doesn't pay any attention to the bibliometrics, but if you go to Google Scholar and look at Spertus, he gets 20,000 citations per year, only exceeded by one person. Harlan Crumbles is.
Yeah. Harlan,
sorry.
And Harlan tweets, and Harlan writes a lot of editorials, and I don't know how he does it. He doesn't drink as much alcohol as I do. I think that's his.
It is really amazing. Yeah, we really.
But I'll tell you one thing about Harlan. Reading a handful of his papers, I mean, they're beautifully crafted. Like a lot of what I'm trying to convey to you is more the art than the science of presenting your work. And a lot, it's that quote, great writing can't save a bad paper, but bad writing can kill a great one. And he's an example where, I mean, not that any of his papers are bad, but they go a tier or two higher because of how well he crafts them. And you just get better over time. I mean, I am so much better than I was even 5 years ago. Harlan
mentioned on my number one cited paper, Harlan co-author, walked me through. He was the primary mentor on helping me
Well, and that was a really important paper. There's I think that he's just very good at that. And and a lot of your discussions with mentors presenting, a lot of times it's the framing. Like you'll use the exact same data, but you'll have a much deeper, more nuanced interpretation of what it actually represents. And that comes from having to present in multiple different forms and getting feedback from different people.
Yeah, we recently made a mistake. So we submitted an article to American Journal of Medicine about our recruitment for obesity treatment study and academic file. And so REACH for obesity treatment should be a big issue for American Journal of Treatment of Medicine. And it got rejected without review. Now the nice thing is that they were going to reject it. So they actually did have, I think, the associate editor review it and then presented it to the editorial team. So they did that ahead of time. So they have a process for rejecting over 65% of my things. But what it made me say is that, well, why didn't they send it out? I go back and I read the abstract and I say, oh, we didn't say why it was really important for their readership. It read like a research treatise as opposed to something public health significant.
I've seen that a lot. I mean, in my own work too, and you just keep getting better. I mean, it's sticking with it that you get better and better. And it is easier when you're reviewing somebody else's work fresh. It's far easier for me to review Yashu's work than for me to write my own paper because you get too close to it. You sort of got to get a fresh, perspective because everything about it. You're so familiar with it. It's so obvious to why it's so important. And
So everybody talks about, okay, well, you get rejected. In fact, I was just told, if you get accepted the first time, you're not shooting high enough.
Yeah.
So getting rejected is okay, but people then say, and then just immediately submit it right away. So you need to do that. But I recommend going back and looking at your abstract. You've got the spring.
Yeah.
How do you feel about full manuscripts versus research briefs versus research letters, and our significance or strategy for when to leave, I guess?
So, we have, so first of all, I don't think it makes a difference in terms of, your CV, your impact, if it's, important stuff. And I really like the concept of brief data reports or brief reports when you're sort of identifying one key issue. My personal experience is that, those are very restricted, 800 words, very limited things. And it has, and when I send those to the journals, they've done a lot worse than our full manuscripts, because even though it's a very constrained format, the reviewers are always asking for more stuff. And so we've had pretty mixed success with that. And so, in theory, it's great. In practice, I've just had a hard time getting in there. And frankly, there just aren't that many brief data reports published, because and I think the editorial boards themselves are sort of struggling with those, because if it's an important nugget of information, well, it raises more questions, and so you would like to have more space to address it, but by definition, you can't. I mean, you had the clever one didn't get in, right?
Yeah, I had the clever, and I actually had another paper actually, reviewed it, and they want to take it as a letter. And then my senior mentor, she said, no, we'd rather send it somewhere else. And actually, Spertus they have a podcast every week, and they actually have chosen, so they have to choose like a paper week or something. Oftentimes they're choosing the letter as a better way, and then they invite like senior editors and say that that these letters could be as important as the full manuscript.
But I'll bet you, so this is interesting, I'll bet you the vast majority of letters were not submitted as letters for research agreements. I think that they like the one that we got into JAMA was, we submitted the thing, asked for it to come back as a research brief. The frustrating thing though is then there's no abstract, and so I think your citations tend to be substantially lower because it's harder for other writers to actually pick up what that manuscript was and cite it in their work. But
sometimes it actually has a problem. So I actually had a letter in that. So we had 11 authors initially, and we showed that the full manuscript, and they said, okay, we'll take out the letter. I said, use the number of authors.
yeah.
Oh.